Do you see this? This is the letter Waw, and it's the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and this will help you understand the structure of the book of Genesis. Check it out. The most predominant divisions within the book of Genesis are traditionally known as the primeval history and the patriarchal history. But the most prominent literary structure in the book of Genesis are the 10 Toledots, or the genealogies that are used as a focusing device to push the narrative forward. However, something strange happens when we look at the Waw. 5 of these genealogies contain a Waw at the beginning, which functions like the conjunction and, while the other 5 genealogies are what we call asyndetic. That is, they don't have this Waw. They don't have a conjunction at the beginning. In Hebrew narrative, the Waw helps to keep the narrative moving forward, which means there are 2 common uses of asyndeton, or the absence of this Waw, in Hebrew narrative. Number 1, it indicates the beginning of a new section, or number 2, it indicates the summary of the section that it is ending. What this means is that these asyndetic genealogies hint at a macro structure to the book of Genesis. Before we can analyze what those sections are, we need to remember that Genesis begins with an introduction before its first genealogy, namely Genesis 1 to 2 verse 3. Well, what is that section doing? Well, it's introducing the purpose of the book, which is primarily to introduce God, who is going to bless his creation, as shown in Genesis 1 verse 28 and at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. From this point forward, assuming God's intention is to bless, we then have 10 genealogies that function as a way of narrowing in or zooming in on the plot's purpose. So imagine in Genesis 1, it's like being out at a beautiful landscape. You see some animal off in the distance, and so how do you focus in on it? You bring up your binoculars to follow it. That's how the genealogies are functioning in Genesis. It starts with the whole cosmos in view, God's intention to bless, and through the genealogies, it begins to zoom in on what it wants you to see. So Genesis 1 starts at the beginning of creation, zoomed out with the intention of God to bless his creation. Then the 10 genealogies focus on answering the question, who is it that's going to inherit this creation blessing? But what about the Waw? Well, because Waw functions as a conjunction, the genealogies containing Waws at the beginning are simply connecting themselves to the prior material. This means if we look at the 5 genealogies that don't have this conjunction, we see 5 major subsections in the book of Genesis. What's strange about this is that Shem's genealogy is usually seen as a conclusion to the primeval history. But when we take into account the lack of conjunction, it means that Shem's genealogy is actually introducing the material that's going to follow. Alternatively, Terah's genealogy, which introduces us to Abram, contains a conjunction, which means it's actually not beginning new material. It's linking itself to the material before it. In other words, the traditional breakdown of primeval history and patriarchal history seems to be artificial, though not without some merit. Instead, if we trace the absence of the Waw through the genealogies, we get these 5 subsections. First, we're introduced to all creation. Then we focus on humanity in general. Then all of living humanity after the flood of judgment. Fourthly, into a subset of living humanity. Fifthly, and concluding, we get to the people of Israel. In other words, the focusing point of these asyndetic genealogies is to draw our attention to the line of promise, namely Israel, surrounded by the nations. But wait, there's more. Not all genealogies are identical. The book of Genesis contains 2 types of genealogies. We have linear genealogies and we have segmented genealogies. The linear genealogies are Adam and Shem's genealogies, and they focus a single descendant through a multitude of generations and conclude with 3 brothers. Alternatively, we have the segmented genealogies, Noah, Ishmael, and Esau, which focus on all the descendants of the succeeding generation. The linear genealogies of Adam and Shem's move smoothly and quickly to arrive at the single line of promise, whereas the segmented genealogies move much slower and cause us to focus on the nations that the line of promise is engaging with. Why does this happen? Well, as Dorochi summarizes, the linear genealogies highlight the ancestry of Israel as the chosen line of promise, but the segmented genealogies are retained in order to give ever-present reminders to Israelite readers that their image-bearing purpose is for the sake of the nations, and that their longed-for deliverer would be the agent of blessing to all the families of the earth. The world was not created for Israel, but she for the world. But when we understand this literary lens to reading the book of Genesis, we begin to see something else. The placement and purpose of both Adam and Shem's genealogies suggests that they are to be read as parallel panels set apart from the introductory section. And this is indicated by the fact that they are the only 2 linear genealogies that began with ascendaton. That is, they're the only linear genealogies that begin new sections. Now, how do we bring all this together? Well, what this means is that the book of Genesis really has three larger units. First, we have the preface, or the introduction, that God has created the world to bless it. Secondly, we see the fall and the promise of an offspring who would overcome the curse. Thirdly, through two parallel panels, we are filled with hope as we see God actively preserving his line of promise, not just for the sake of Israel, but to bless the nations who have rebelled against him.